16. Autopsy. Burton was working in the autopsy room. He was nervous and tense, still bothered by his memories of Piedmont. Weeks later, in reviewing his work and his thoughts on Level 5, he regretted his inability to concentrate. Because in his initial series of experiments, Burton made several mistakes. According to the protocol, he was required to carry out autopsies on dead animals, but he was also in charge of preliminary vector experiments. In all fairness, Burton was not the man to do this work. Levitt would have been better suited to it. But it was felt that Levitt was more useful working on preliminary isolations and identification. So the vector experiments fell to Burton. They were reasonably simple and straightforward, designed to answer the question of how the disease was transmitted. Burton began with a series of cages lined up in a row. Each had a separate air supply. The air supplies could be interconnected in a variety of ways. Burton placed the corpse of the dead Norway rat, which was contained in an airtight cage, alongside another cage containing a living rat. He punched buttons. Air was all allowed to pass freely from one cage to the other. The living rat flopped over and died. Interesting, he thought. Airborne transmission. He hooked up a second cage with a live rat, but inserted a millipore filter between the living and dead rat cages. This filter had perforations 100 angstroms in diameter, the size of a small virus. He opened the passage between the two cages. The rat remained alive. He watched for several moments until he was satisfied. Whatever it was that transmitted the disease, it was larger than a virus. He changed the filter, replacing it with a larger one, and then another, still larger. He continued in this way until the rat died. The filter had allowed the agent to pass. He checked it. 2 microns in diameter, roughly the size of a small cell. He thought to himself that he had just learned something very valuable indeed. The size of the infectious agent. This was important, for in a single simple experiment, he had ruled out the possibility that a protein or a chemical molecule of some kind was doing the damage. At Piedmont, he and Stone had been concerned about a gas, perhaps a gas released as waste from the living organism. Yet clearly no gas was responsible. The disease was transmitted by something the size of a cell. That was very much bigger than a molecule or a gas droplet. The next step was equally simple: to determine whether dead animals were potentially infectious. He took one of the dead rats and pumped the air out of its cage. He waited until the air was fully evacuated. In the pressure fall, the rat ruptured, bursting open. Burton ignored this. When he was sure all air was removed, he replaced the air with fresh, clean, filtered air. Then he connected the cage to the cage of a living animal. Nothing happened. Interesting, he thought. Using a remotely controlled scalpel, he sliced open the dead animal further to make sure any organisms contained inside the carcass would be released into the atmosphere. Nothing happened. The live rat scampered about its cage happily. The results were quite clear. Dead animals were not infectious. That was why he thought the buzzards could chew at the piedmont victims and not died. Corpses could not transmit the disease. Only the bugs themselves carried in the air could do so. Bugs in the air were deadly. Bugs in the corpse were harmless. In a sense, this was predictable. It had to do with theories of accommodations and mutual adaptations between bacteria and man. Burton has long been interested in this problem and had lectured on it at the Baylor Medical School. Most people, when they thought of bacteria, thought of diseases. Yet the fact was that only 3% of bacteria produced human disease. The rest were either harmless or beneficial. In the human gut, for instance, there were a variety of bacteria that were helpful to the digestive process. Man needed them and relied upon them. In fact, man lived in a sea of bacteria. They were everywhere, on his skin, in his ears and mouth, down his lungs, in his stomach. Everything he owned, anything he touched, every breath he breathed was drenched in bacteria. Bacteria was ubiquitous. Most of the time, you weren't aware of it. And there was a reason. Both man and bacteria had gotten used to each other, had developed a kind of mutual immunity. Each adapted to the other. And this, in turn, for a very good reason. It was a principle of biology that evolution was directed toward increased reproductive potential. A man easily killed by bacteria was poorly adapted. He didn't live long enough to reproduce. A bacteria that killed its host was also poorly adapted, because any parasite that kills its host is a failure. It must die when the host dies. The successful parasites were those that could live off the host without killing him. And the most successful hosts were those that could tolerate the parasite, or even turned it to advantage, to make it work for the host. The best adapted bacteria, Burton used to say, are the ones that causes minor diseases, or none at all. You may carry the same single cell of strep viridians on your body for 60 or 70 years. During that time, you are growing and reproducing happily, so is the strep. You can carry staph aureus around and pay only the price of some acne and pimples. You can carry tuberculosis for many decades. You can carry syphilis for a lifetime. These last are not minor diseases, but they are much less severe than they once were, because both man and organisms have adapted. It was known, for instance, that syphilis had been a virulent disease for 100 years before, producing huge festering sores all over the body, often killing in weeks. But over the centuries, man and the spirochae had learned to tolerate each other. Such considerations were not so abstract and academic as they seemed at first. In the early planning of wildfire, Stone had observed that 40% of all human disease was caused by microorganisms. Burton had countered by noting that only 3% of all microorganisms caused disease. Obviously, while much human misery was attributable to bacteria, the chances of any particular bacteria being dangerous to man were very small. This was because the process of adaptation of fitting man to bacteria was complex. Most bacteria, Burton observed, simply can't live within a man long enough to harm him. Conditions are, one way or another, unfavorable. The body is too hot or too cold, too acid or too alkaline. There is too much oxygen or not enough. Man's body is as hostile as Antarctica to most bacteria. This meant that the chances of an organisms from outer space being suited to harm man were very slim. Everyone recognized this, but felt that wildfire had to be constructed in any event. Burton certainly agreed, but felt in an odd way that his prophecy had come true. Clearly the bug they had found could kill men, but it was not really adapted to men, because it killed and died within the organisms. It could not be transmitted from corpse to corpse. It existed for a second or two in its host, and then died with it. Satisfying intellectually, he thought, but practically speaking, they still had to isolate it, understand it, and find a cure. Burton already knew something about transmission, and something about the mechanisms of death, clotting of the blood. The questions remained. How did the organisms get into the body? Because transmissions appeared to be airborne. Contact with skin and lungs seemed likely. Possibly the organisms burrowed right through the skin surface, or they might be inhaled, or both. How to determine it? He considered putting protective suitings around an experimental animal to cover all but the mouth. That was possible, but it would take a long time. He sat and worried about the problem for an hour. Then he hit upon a more likely approach. He knew that the organisms killed by clotting blood. Very likely it would initiate clotting at the point of entrance into the body. If skin, clotting would start near the surface. If lungs, it would begin in the chest, radiating outward. This was something he could test by using radioactively tagged blood proteins, and then following his animals with scintillometer scans. He could determine where in the body the blood first clotted. He prepared a suitable animal, choosing a rhesus monkey, because its anatomy was more human than a rat's. He infused the radioactive tagging substance, a magnesium isotope, into the monkey and calibrated the scanner. After allowing equilibration, he tied the monkey down and positioned the scanner overhead. He was now ready to begin. The scanner would print out its results on a series of human block outlines. He set the computer printing program and then exposed the rhesus to air containing the lethal microorganism. Immediately, the printout began to clatter out from the computer. It was all over in 3 seconds. The graphic printout told him what he needed to know, that clotting began in the lungs and spread outward through the rest of the body. But there was an additional piece of information gained. Button later said, "I had been concerned that perhaps death and clotting did not coincide, or at least did not coincide exactly. It seemed impossible to me that death could occur in 3 seconds, but it seemed even more unlikely that the total blood volume of the body, 5 quarts, could solidify in so short a period. I was curious to know whether a single crucial clot might form, in the brain, perhaps, and the rest of the body clot at a slower pace." Button was thinking of the brain, even at this early stage of his investigation. In retrospect, it is frustrating that he did not follow this line of inquiry to its logical conclusion. He was prevented from doing this by the evidence of the scans, which told him that clotting began in the lungs and progressed up the carotid arteries to the brain 1 or 2 seconds later. So, Button lost immediate interest in the brain, and his mistake was compounded by his next experiment. It was a simple test, not part of the regular wildfire protocol. Button knew that death coincided with blood clotting. If clotting could be prevented, could death be avoided? He took several rats and injected them with heparin, an anticoagulating drug, preventing blood clot formation. Heparin was a rapid-acting drug widely used in medicine. Its actions were thoroughly understood. Button injected the drug intravenously in varying amounts, ranging from a low, normal dose to a massively excessive dose. Then he exposed the rats to air containing the lethal organism. The first rat, with a low dose, died in 5 seconds. The others followed within a minute. A single rat was a massive dose, lived nearly 3 minutes, but he also succumbed in the end. Button was depressed by the results. Although death was delayed, it was not prevented. The method of symptomatic treatment did not work. He put the dead rats to one side, and then made his crucial mistake. Button did not autopsy the anticoagulated rats. Instead, He turned his attention to the original autopsy specimen, the first black Norway rat, and the first rhesus monkey to be exposed to the capsule. He performed a complete autopsy on these animals, but discarded the anticoagulated animals. It would be 48 hours before he realized his error. The autopsies he performed were careful and good. He did them slowly, reminding himself that he must overlook nothing. He removed the internal organs from the rat and monkey and examined each, removing samples for both the light and electron microscopes. To gross inspections, the animals had died of total intravascular coagulations. The arteries, the heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, and spleen, all the blood-containing organs, were rock-hard solid. This was what he had expected. He carried his tissue slices across the room to prepare frozen sections for microscopic examination. As each section was completed by his technician, he slipped it under the microscope, examined it, and photographed it. The tissues were normal, except for the clotted blood. There was nothing unusual about them at all. He knew that these same pieces of tissue would now be sent to the microscopy lab, where another technician would prepare stained sections using hematoxylin eosin, periodic acid Schiff, and Zenker formalin strains. Sections of nerve would be stained with Nissel and Cahill gold preparations. This process would take an additional 12 to 15 hours. He could hope, of course, that the stained sections would reveal something more, but he had no reason to believe they would. Similarly, he was unenthusiastic about the prospects for electron microscopy. The electron microscope was a valuable tool, but occasionally it made things more difficult, not easier. The electron microscope could provide great magnifications and clear detail, but only if you knew where to look. It was excellent for examining a single cell, or part of a cell, but first you had to know which cell to examine. And there were billions of cells in a human body. At the end of 10 hours of work, he sat back to consider what he had learned. He drew up a short list. 1. The lethal agent is approximately 1 micron in size. Therefore, it is not a gas or molecule, or even a large protein or virus. It is the size of a cell, and may actually be a cell of some sort. 2. The lethal agent is transmitted by air. Dead organisms are not infectious. 3. The lethal agent is inspired by the victim, entering the lungs. There it presumably crosses over into the bloodstream and starts coagulation. 4. The lethal agent causes death through coagulations. This occurs within seconds and coincides with total coagulations of the entire body vascular system. 5. Anticoagulant drugs do not prevent this process. 6. No other pathological abnormalities are known to occur in the dying animal. Burton looked at his list and shook his head. Anticoagulants might not work, but the fact was that something stopped the process. There was a way that it could be done. He knew that, because 2 people had survived. 17. Recovery. At 11:47 hours, Mark Hall was bent over the computer, staring at the console that showed the laboratory results from Peter Jackson's and the infant. The computer was giving results as they were finished by the automated laboratory equipment. By now, nearly all results were in. The infant, Hall observed, was normal. The computer did not mince words. Subject-coded infant shows all laboratory values within normal limits. However, Peter Jackson was another problem entirely. His results were abnormal in several respects. Subject-coded Jackson Peter. Laboratory values not within normal limits follow. Test normal value. Hematocrit 38 through 54, 21 initial, 25 repeat, 29 repeat, 33 repeat, 37 repeat. Bun 10 20 50, counts 1 6. Retic. Blood smears shows many immature erythrocytes forms. Test normal value. Protime L2 12. Blood pH 7.40, 7.31. Escot 40 75. Sed rate 9 29. MLS 70 to 200 450. Some of these results were easy to understand, others were not. The hematocrit, for example, was rising because Jackson was receiving transfusions of whole blood and packed red cells. The BUN, or blood urea nitrogen, was a test of kidney functions and was mildly elevated, probably because of decreased blood flow. Other analyses were consistent with blood loss. The reticulite count was up from 1 to 6%. Jackson had been anemic for some time. He showed immature red cell forms, which meant that his body was struggling to replace lost blood, and so had to put young immature red cells into circulation. The prothrombin time indicated that while Jackson was bleeding from somewhere in his gastrointestinal tract, he had no primary bleeding problems. His blood clotted normally. The sedimentation rate and escot were indices of tissue destruction. Somewhere in Jackson's body tissues were dying off, but the pH of the blood was a bit of a puzzle at 7.31. It was too acid, though not strikingly so. Hall was at a loss to explain this. So was the computer. Subject coded Jackson Peter. Diagnostic probabilities 1. Acute and chronic blood loss. Etiology gastrointestinal 0.884. No other statistically significant sources. 2. Acidosis etiology. Unexplained. Further data required. Suggests history. Hall read the printout and shrugged. The computer might suggest he talked to the patient, but that was easier said than done. Jackson was comatose, and if he had ingested anything to make his blood acid, they would not find out until he revived. On the other hand, perhaps he could test blood gases. He turned to the computer and punched in a request for blood gases. The computer responded stubbornly. Patient's history preferable to laboratory analysis. Hall typed in patient comatose. The computer seemed to consider this and then flashed back. Patient monitors not compatible with coma. EEG shows alpha waves. Diagnostics of sleep. I'll be damned, Hall said. He looked through the window and saw that Jackson was indeed stirring sleepily. He crawled down through the tunnel to his plastic suit and leaned over the patient. Mr. Jackson, wake up. Slowly he opened his eyes and stared at Hall. He blinked, not believing. Don't be frightened, Hall said quietly. You're sick, and we have been taking care of you. Do you feel better? Jackson swallowed and nodded. He seemed afraid to speak, but the pallor of his skin was gone. His cheeks had a slight pinkish tinge. His fingernails were no longer gray. How do you feel now? Okay. Who are you? I am Dr. Hall. I have been taking care of you. You were bleeding very badly. We had to give you a transfusion. He nodded, accepting this quite calmly. Somehow, his manner rung a bell for Hall, who said, Has this happened to you before? Yes, he said, thrice. How did it happen before? I don't know where I am, he said, looking around the room. Is this a hospital? Why are you wearing that thing? No, this isn't a hospital. It is a special laboratory in Nevada. Nevada. He closed his eyes and shook his head. But I'm in Arizona. Not now. We brought you here so we could help you. How come that suit? We brought you from Piedmont. There was a disease in Piedmont. You are now in an isolation chamber. You mean I'm contagious? Well, we don't know for sure. But we must... Listen, he said, suddenly trying to get up. This place gives me the creeps. I'm getting out of here. I don't like it here. He struggled in the bed, trying to move against the straps. Hall pushed him back gently. Just relax, Mr. Jackson. Everything will be all right. But you must relax. You've been a sick man. Slowly, Jackson lay back. Then, I want a cigarette. I'm afraid you can't have one. What the hell? I want one. I'm sorry, smoking is not allowed. Look here, young fella. When you've lived as long as I have, you'll know what you can do and what you can't do. They told me before. None of that Mexican food, no liquor, no butts. I tried it for a spell. You know how that makes a body feel. Terrible. Just terrible. Who told you? The doctors. What doctors? Those doctors in Phoenix. Big fancy hospital. All that shiny equipment and all those shiny light uniforms. Real fancy hospital. I wouldn't have gone there except for my sister. She insisted she lives in Phoenix. You know, with that husband of hers. George Stupid Ninny. I didn't want no fancy hospital. I just wanted to rest up, is all. But she insisted, so I went. When was this? Last year. June, it was. Or July. Why did you go to the hospital? Why does anybody go to the hospital? I was sick, damn it. What was your problem? This damn stomach of mine. Same as always. Bleeding? Christ, bleeding. Every time I hiccuped, I came up with blood. Never knew a body had so much blood in it. Bleeding in your stomach? Yeah, like I said. I had it before. All these needles stuck in you. He nodded to the intravenous lines. And all that blood going into you. Phoenix last year. And then Tucson's the year before that. Now, Tucson's was a right nice place. Right nice. Had me a pretty little nurse and all. Abruptly, he closed his mouth. How old are you, son, anyhow? You don't seem old enough to be a doctor. I'm a surgeon, Hall said. Surgeon? Oh, no, you don't. They kept trying to get me to do it. And I kept saying, not on your sweet life. No, indeedy. Not taking it out of me. You've had an ulcer for 2 years? A bit more. The pain started out of the clear blue. Thought I had a touch of indigestion, you know. Until the bleeding started up. A 2-year history, Hall thought. Definitely ulcer, not cancer. And you went to the hospital? Yep. Fixed me up fine. Warned me off spicy foods, and hard stuff, and cigarettes. And I tried, Sonny. I sure did. But it wasn't no good. A man gets used to his pleasures. So, in a year, you were back in the hospital. Yeah, big old place in Phoenix, with that stupid ninny George. And my sister visiting me every day. He's a book-learning fool, you know. Lawyer. Talks real big. But he hasn't got the sense God gave a grasshopper's behind. And they wanted to operate in Phoenix? Sure they did. No offense, Sonny, but any doctor'll operate on you. Give him half a chance. It's the way they think. I just told them I'd gone this far with my old stomach, and I reckoned I'd finish the stretch with it. When did you leave the hospital? Must have been early August sometime. First week or thereabouts. And when did you start smoking and drinking and eating the wrong foods? Now, don't lecture me, Sonny, Jackson said. I've been living for 69 years, eating all the wrong foods and doing all the wrong things. I like it that way, and if I can't keep it up, well then the hell with it. But you must have had pain, Hall said, frowning. Oh, sure. It kicked up some, especially if I didn't eat. But I found a way to fix that. Yes? Sure. They gave me this milk stuff at the hospital, and wanted me to keep on with it. 100 times a day in little sips. Milk stuff. Tasted like chalk. But I found a better thing. What was that? Aspirin, Jackson said. Aspirin? Sure. Works real nice. How much aspirin did you take? Fair bit toward the end. I was doing a bottle a day. You know them bottles it comes in? Hall nodded. No wonder the man was acid. Aspirin was acetylsalicylic acid, and if it was taken in sufficient quantities, it would be acidify you. Aspirin was a gastric irritant, and it could exacerbate bleeding. Didn't anybody tell you aspirin would make the bleeding worse? He asked. Sure, Jackson said. They told me, but I didn't mind none. Because it stopped the pain, see? That's that, plus a little squeeze. Squeeze? Red eye, you know. Hall shook his head. He didn't know. Stunno, pink lady, you take it, see? And put it in cloth and squeeze it out. Hall sighed. You're a drinking sterno, he said. Well, only when I couldn't get nothing else. Aspirin and squeeze, see, really kills that pain. Sterno isn't only alcohol, it's methanol, too. Doesn't hurt you, does it? Jackson asked in a voice suddenly concerned. As a matter of fact, it does. It can make you go blind, and it can even kill you. Well, hell. It made me feel better, so I took it, Jackson said. Did this aspirin and squeeze have any effect on you? On your breathing? Well, now you mentioned it, I was a tad short of breath. But what the hell? I don't need much breath at my age. Jackson yawned and closed his eyes. You're awful full of questions, boy. I want to sleep now. Hull looked at him and decided the man was right. It would be best to proceed slowly, at least for a time. He crawled back down the tunnel and out to the main room. He turned to his assistant. Our friend Mr. Jackson has a 2-year history of ulcer. We'd better keep the blood going in for another couple of units. Then we can stop and see what's happening. Drop an NG tube and start ice water lavage. A gong rang, echoing softly through the room. What's that? The 12-hour mark. It means we have to change our clothing. And it means you have a conference. I do? Where? The CR off the dining room. Hall nodded and left. In Delta Sector, the computers hummed and clicked softly as Captain Arthur Morris punched through a new program on the console. Captain Morris was a programmer. He had been sent to Delta Sector by the command on Level 1 because no MCN messages had been received for 9 hours. It was possible, of course, that there had been no priority transmissions, but it was also unlikely. And if there had been unreceived MCN messages, then the computers were not functioning properly. Captain Morris watched as the computer ran its usual internal check program, which read out as all circuits functioning. Unsatisfied, he punched in the checklim program, a more rigorous testing of the circuit banks. It required 0.03 seconds for the machine to come back with its answer. A row of 5 green lights blinked on the console. He walked over to the teleprinter and watched as it typed. Machine functioned on all circuits, within rational indices. He looked and nodded satisfied. He could not have known, as he stood before the teleprinter, that there was indeed a fault, but that it was purely mechanical, not electronic, and hence could not be tested on the check programs. The fault lay within the teleprinter box itself. There a sliver of paper from the edge of the roll had peeled away and, curling upward, had lodged between the bell and striker, preventing the bell from ringing. It was for this reason that no MCN transmissions had been recorded. Neither machine nor man was able to catch the error. 18. The noon conference. According to protocol, the team met every 12 hours for a brief conference, at which results were summarized and new directions planned. In order to save time, the conferences were held in a small room off the cafeteria. They could eat and talk at the same time. Hall was the last to arrive. He slipped into a chair behind his lunch. 2 glasses of liquid and 3 pills of different colors. Just as Stone said, "We'll hear from Burton first." Burton shuffled to his feet and in a slow, hesitant voice outlined his experiments and his results. He noted first that he had determined the size of the lethal agent to be 1 micron. Stone and Levitt looked at each other. The green flecks they had seen were much larger than that. Clearly, infection could be spread by a mere fraction of the green fleck. Burton next explained his experiments concerning airborne transmissions and coagulations beginning at the lungs. He finished with his attempts at anticoagulation therapy. "What about the autopsies?" Stone said. "What did they show?" "Nothing we don't already know. The blood is clotted throughout. No other demonstrable abnormalities at the light microscope level." "And clotting is initiated at the lungs?" "Yes. Presumably the organisms cross over to the bloodstream there. Or they may release a toxic substance which crosses over. We may have an answer when the stained sections are finished. In particular, we will be looking for damage to blood vessels, since this releases tissue thromboplastin and stimulates clotting at the site of damage." Stone nodded and turned to Hall, who told of the tests carried out on his 2 patients. He explained that the infant was normal to all tests, and that Jackson had a bleeding ulcer for which he was receiving transfusions. "He's revived," Hall said. "I talked with him briefly." Everyone sat up. "Mr. Jackson is a cranky old goat of 69, who has a 2-year history of ulcer. He's bled out twice before, 2 years ago and again last year. Each time he was warned to change his habits. Each time he went back to his old ways and began bleeding again. At the time of the Piedmont contact, he was treating his problems with his own regime regimen. A bottle of aspirin a day and some sterno on top of it. He says this left him a little short of breath and made him an acidotic as hell, Burton said. Exactly. Methanol, when broken down by the body, was converted to formaldehyde and formic acid. In combinations with aspirin, it meant Jackson was consuming great quantities of acid. The body had to maintain its acid-base balance within fairly narrow limits or death would occur. One way to keep the balance was to breathe rapidly and blow off carbon dioxide, decreasing carbonic acid in the body. Stone said, "Could this acid have protected him from the organisms?" Hall shrugged. "Impossible to say." Levitt said, "What about the infant? Was it anemic?" "No," Hall said. "But on the other hand, we don't know for sure that it was protected by the same mechanisms. It might have something entirely different." "How about the acid-base balance of the child?" "Normal," Hall said. "Perfectly normal. At least it is now." There was a moment of silence. Finally, Stone said, "Well, you have some good leads here. The problem remains to discover what, if anything, that child and that old man have in common. Perhaps, as you suggest, there is nothing in common. But for a start, we have to assume that they were protected in the same way by the same mechanisms." Hall nodded. Burton said to Stone, "And what have you found in the capsule?" "We'd better show you," Stone said. "Show us what?" "Something we believe may represent the organisms," Stone said. The door said morphology. Inside, the room was portioned into a place for the experimenters to stand, and a glass-walled isolation chamber further in. Gloves were provided so the men could reach into the chamber and move instruments about. Stone pointed to the glass dish and the small fleck of black inside it. "We think this is our meteor," he said. "We have found something apparently alive on its surface." There were also other areas within the capsule that may represent life. We've brought the meteor in here to have a look at it under the light microscope. Reaching through with the gloves, Stone set the glass dish into an opening in a large chrome box, then withdrew his hands. "The box," he said, "is simply a light microscope fitted with the usual image intensifiers and resolution scanners. We can go up to 1,000 diameters with it, projected on the screen here." Levitt adjusted the dials while Hall and the others stared at the viewer's screen. 10 power, Levitt said. On the screen, Hall saw that the rock was jagged, blackish, dull. Stone pointed out green flecks. 100 power. The green flecks were larger now, very clear. "We think that's our organism. We have observed it growing. It turns purple, apparently at the point of mitotic divisions." Spectrum shift of some kind. 1000 power, Levitt said. The screen was filled with a single green spot, nestled down in the jagged hollows of the rock. Hall noticed that the surface of the green, which was smooth and glistening, almost oily. You think that's a single bacterial colony? We can't be sure it's a colony in the conventional sense, Stone said. Until we heard Burton's experiments, we didn't think it was a colony at all. We thought it might be a single organisms. But obviously the single units have to be a micron or less in size. This is much too big. Therefore, it is probably a larger structure. Perhaps a colony. Perhaps something else. As they watched, the spot turned purple and green again. It's dividing now, Stone said. Excellent. Levitt switched on the cameras. Now watch closely. The spot turned purple and held the color. It seemed to expand slightly, and for a moment the surface broke into fragments, hexagonal in shape, like a tile floor. Did you see that? It seemed to break up into six-sided figures. I wonder, Stone said, whether those figures represent single units, or whether they are regular geometric shapes all the time, or just during division. We'll know more, Stone said, after the EM. He turned to Burton. Have you finished your autopsies? Yes. Can you work the spectrometer? I think so. Then do that. It's computerized, anyway. We'll want an analysis of samples of both the rock and the green organisms. You'll get me a piece? Yes, Stone said to Levitt. Can you handle the AA analyzer? Yes. Same test on that? And a fractionation. I think so, Stone said. But you'll have to do that by hand. Levitt nodded. Stone turned back to the isolation chamber and removed a glass dish from the light microscope. He set it to one side, beneath a small device that looked like a miniature scaffolding. This was the microsurgical unit. Microsurgery was a relatively new skill in biology. The ability to perform delicate operations on a single cell. Using microsurgical techniques, it was possible to remove the nucleus from a cell, or a part of the cytoplasm, as neatly and cleanly as a surgeon performed an amputation. The device was constructed to scale down human hand movements into fine, precise miniature motions. A series of gears and servo mechanisms carried out the reductions. The movement of a thumb was translated into a shift of a knife blade, millionths of an inch. Using a high magnification viewer, Stone began to chip away delicately at the black rock until he had two tiny fragments. He set them aside in separate glass dishes and proceeded to scrape away two small fragments from the green area. Immediately, the green turned purple and expanded. It doesn't like you, Levitt said, and laughed. Stone frowned. Interesting. Do you suppose that's a non-specific growth response? Or a trophic response to injury and irradiation? I think Levitt said that it doesn't like to be poked at. We must investigate further, Stone said. 19. Crash. For Arthur Manchek, there was a certain kind of horror in the telephone conversations. He received it at home, having just finished dinner and sat down in the living room to read the newspapers. He hadn't seen a newspaper in the last 2 days. He had been so busy with the Piedmont business. When the phone rang, he assumed that it must be for his wife. But a moment later, she came in and said, "It's for you. The base." He had an uneasy feeling as he picked up the receiver. Major Manchek speaking. "Major, this is Colonel Burns at Unit 8. Unit 8 was the processing and killing unit of the base. Personnel checked in and out through Unit 8, and calls were transmitted through it." "Yes, Colonel?" "Sir, we have you down for notifications of certain contingencies." His voice was guarded. He was choosing his words carefully on the open line. "I'm informing you now of an RTM crash 42 minutes ago in Big Head, Utah." Manchek frowned. Why was he being informed of a routine training mission crash? It was hardly his province. What was it? "Phantom, sir. En route San Francisco to Topeka." "I see," Manchek said, though he did not see at all. "Sir, Goddard wanted you to be informed in this instance, so that you could join the post team." "Goddard? Why Goddard?" For a moment, as he sat there in the living room, staring at the newspaper headline up absently, "New Berlin crisis feared," he thought that the colonel meant Louis Goddard, chief of the codes sections of Vandenberg. Then he realized he meant Goddard Space Flight Center, outside Washington. Among other things, Goddard acted as collating center for certain special projects that fell between the province of Houston and the governmental agencies in Washington. "Sir," Colonel Burns said, "the Phantom drifted off its flight plan 40 minutes out of San Francisco and passed through Area WF." Manchek felt himself slowing down. A kind of sleepiness came over him. "Area WF?" "That is correct, sir." "When?" 20 minutes before the crash." "At what altitude?" 23,000 feet, sir." "When does the post team leave?" "Half an hour, sir, from the base." "All right," Manchek said. "I'll be there." He hung up and stared at the phone lazily. He felt tired. He wished he could go to bed. Area WF was the destination for the cordoned-off radius around Piedmont, Arizona. They should have dropped the bomb, he thought. They should have dropped it 2 days ago. At the time of the decisions to delay Directive 712, Manchek had been uneasy, but officially he could not express an opinion, and he had waited in vain for the wildfire team. Now located in the underground laboratory to complain to Washington. He knew Wildfire had been notified. He had seen the cable that went to all security units. It was quite explicit. Yet for some reason, Wildfire had not complained. Indeed, they had paid no attention to it whatever. Very odd. And now there was a crash. He lit his pipe and sucked on it. Considering the possibilities, overwhelming was the likelihood that some green trainee had daydreamed, gone off his flight plan, panicked, and lost control of the plane. It had happened before, hundreds of times. The post team, a group of specialists who went out to the site of the wreckage to investigate all crashes, usually returned a verdict of agnogenic systems failure. It was military double talk for crash of unknown cause. It did not distinguish between mechanical failure and pilot failure, but it was known that most systems failures were pilot failures. A man could not afford to daydream when he was running a complex machine at thousands miles an hour. The proof lay in the statistics that only 9% of flights occurred after the pilot had taken a leave or weekend pass. These flights accounted for 27% of casualties. Manchek's pipe went out. He stood, dropping the newspaper, and went into the kitchen to tell his wife he was leaving. "This is movie country," somebody said, looking at the sandstone cliffs, the brilliant reddish hues against the deepening blue of the sky. And it was true, many movies had been filmed in this area of Utah. But Manchek could not think of movies now. As he sat in the back of the limousine, moving away from the Utah airport, he considered what he had been told. During the flight from Vandenberg to southern Utah, the post team had heard transcripts of the flight transmissions between the Phantom and Topeka Central. For the most part, it was dull, except for the final moments before the pilot crashed. The pilot had said, "Something is wrong," and then a moment later, "My rubber ear hose is dissolving. It must be the vibrations. It's just disintegrating to dust." Perhaps 10 seconds after that, a weak, fading voice said, "Everything's made of rubber in the cockpit is dissolving." There were no further transmissions. Manchek kept hearing that brief communications in his mind, over and over. Each time it sounded more bizarre and terrifying. He looked out the window at the cliffs. The sun was setting now, and only the tops of the cliffs were lighted by fading reddish sunlight. The valleys lay in darkness. He looked ahead at the other limousines, raising a small dust cloud as it carried the rest of the team to the crash site. "I used to love westerns," somebody said. "They were all shot out here. Beautiful country." Manchek frowned. It was astonishing to him how people could spend so much time on irrelevancies. Or perhaps it was just denial, the unwillingness to face reality. The reality was cold enough the Phantom had strayed into Area WF, going quite deep for a matter of 6 minutes before the pilot realized the error and pulled north again. However, once in WF, the plane had begun to lose stability, and it had finally crashed. He said, "Has Wildfire been informed?" A member of the group, a psychiatrist with a crew cut. All post teams had at least one psychiatrist, said, "You mean the germ people?" "Yes. They've been told." Somebody else said, "It went out on the scrambler an hour ago." Then thought Manchek, there would certainly be a reaction from Wildfire. They could not afford to ignore this, unless they weren't reading their cables. It had never occurred to him before, but perhaps it was possible. They weren't reading the cables. They were so absorbed in their work, they just weren't bothering. "There's the wreck," somebody said, up ahead. Each time Manchik saw a wreck, he was astonished somehow. One never got used to the idea of the sprawl, the mess, the destructive force of a large metal object striking the earth at thousands of miles an hour. He always expected a neat, tight little clump of metal, but it was never that way. The wreckage of the Phantom was scattered over 2 square miles of desert, standing next to the charred remnants of the left ring. He could barely see the others on the horizon, near the right ring. Everywhere he looked, there were bits of twisted metal, blackened paint peeling. He saw one with a small portion of a sign still intact, the stenciled letters clear, "Do not." The rest was gone. It was impossible to make anything of the remnants. The fuselage, the cockpit, the canopy were all shattered into a million fragments, and the fires had disfigured everything. As the sun faded, he found himself standing near the remains of the tail sections, where the metal still radiated heat from the smoldering fire. Half buried in the sand, he saw a bit of bone. He picked it up and realized, with horror, that it was human, long and broken and charred at one end. It had obviously come from an arm or a leg, but it was oddly clean. There was no flesh remaining, only smooth bone. Darkness descended, and the post team took out the flashlights. The half-dozen men moving among smoking metal, flashing their yellow beams of light about. It was late in the evening when a biochemist whose name he did not know came up to talk with him. "You know," the biochemist said, "it's funny. That transcript about the rubber in the cockpit dissolving." "How do you mean?" "Well, no rubber was used in this airplane. It was all a synthetic plastic compound, newly developed by Ankro. They're quite proud of it. It's a polymer that has some of the same characteristics as human tissue. Very flexible. Lots of applications." Manchik said, "Do you think vibrations could have caused the disintegrations?" "No," the man said. "There are thousands of phantoms flying around the world. They all have this plastic. None of them has ever had this trouble, meaning that I don't know what the hell is going on," the biochemist said.